I premise that by the term synthesis of apprehension, I understand the combination of the manifold in an empirical intuition, whereby perception, that is, empirical consciousness of the intuition as phenomenon, is possible. Immanuel Kant. In my previous lecture on the apperception, I talked about what thinking is according to Kant and what the role of thinking is. Thinking, according to Kant, always means connecting, synthesizing, bringing things together. And in that last lecture, I talked about how the very first act of the intellect, the first act of thinking, is the act of apperception or self-consciousness, which means bringing together our various representations, our various thoughts and feelings and images we have, bringing them all together and connecting them in the synthetic unity of apperception there is, bringing them together as being the representations of one and the same subject, saying I am, because according to Kant, this statement, I think, must be able to accompany all my representations. I can always say I think this, I see this, I am imagining this, and this I is always the same, but not in the sense of just being the same, as if that I was already there and then, among other things, happened to think, happened to be conscious, but rather this I is created by thinking, by the act of perceiving our various representations as belonging to one and the same subject. This subject is constituted, so to say. Well, and that was the first of the three parts of our experience, of our empirical cognition. I now want to turn to the second part, and that is what Kant calls apprehension. And here we turn to the things that we perceive, because apprehension means that our various sensations, our various impressions are sort of collected and brought together into a synthetic unity once again by the power of imagination to form one image out of them, which then, that would be the third step, which then can be understood by the intellect. So previously, 2 lectures ago, in my lecture on sensuality and on space and time as forms of viewing, what I said was that according to Kant, perception is completely sensual, and remember, sensuality is passive. According to him, he defines sensuality as the faculty of receptiveness, while thinking is spontaneous. I said that perceptions belong to sensuality, they are sensual representations, and that they have 2 parts. They have their material or content, which is our sensations, red and green and salty and warm and so on. and the perceptions have a form, or rather two forms. Space as the form of our outer sense, and time as the form of viewing of our inner sense. But now I must correct what I said before, or rather, not correct it in the sense that it was simply wrong, but I must be a bit more precise, and I have to add something to what I said before, because in fact, even perceptions, which are sensual representations, even perceptions are not entirely sensual, entirely passive. Even they need thinking with its spontaneity, Kant would say, because they need to be apprehended as a unity by the power of imagination. Of course, the power of imagination, I talked about this in the previous lecture on sensuality, belongs to sensuality, Kant says, but it is sort of the part that connects sensuality with the thinking faculty, because in apprehension, Kant says apprehension is done by the power of imagination, but it is done, so to say, under the direction of the intellect. Because it is always our thinking faculty, it is always the intellect which tries to bring unity into the manifold. And since that unity isn't just there, but needs to first be created, so to say, it is a synthetic unity. So, directed by the intellect, our power of imagination brings a synthetic unity into our impressions, into our sensations. That act is apprehension, and that act is what gives us perceptions. Without it, we would not really perceive things like a house or a tree. Rather, there would just be a chaos of various impressions of colors and smells and tastes and sounds happening in time and space, because they are the only forms in which we can view things. But content, the sensations, and form, time and space, is not enough. The content also needs to be connected within that form. The content needs to have some sort of unity. And that is what apprehension is about. That is what the power of imagination is creating. So, before Kant, the power of imagination was thought of more as a passive faculty, working according to laws of association. Of course, that happens too, but what Kant is showing is that the power of imagination can be active, it can be spontaneous, under the direction of the intellect. Here, of course, the problem in understanding this is that the average person often has this, naive empiricism. We tend to think of ourselves as just cameras or mirrors. We tend to basically have this opinion of Locke, who said that the human being, or that the intellect of the human being, is an empty table, and experience, so to say, write things down on it. So people believe that they just, that perception is entirely passive, that apprehending something is entirely passive, and that we apprehend the things as they are. They just sort of fall through the windows of our eyes, so to say, into our brain, and are reflected there as on a mirror. People don't realize the role, the power of imagination plays in the way they perceive the world. But in this, both physics and also psychology in the last 200 years have come closer and closer to the same understanding Kant had. And I want to give some examples from life to maybe help you get a sense of what an important role the power of imagination, the productive power of imagination, plays in your perceptions of the world. Let's start with this image I'm showing here on screen. If I asked you, what does it show? You would probably say it shows a smiling face. It's a smiley. But in fact, what it shows is two dots and a curved line, right? They are not directly connected. It is you who apprehends these as belonging together, as belonging to one and the same thing, that is the same smiley. So the judgment, this thing is a smiley, this thing is an image of a smiling face, that is already a judgment that concerns the intellect, that concerns our concepts through which we understand things, and that is not the topic of this lecture. That is going to be the topic of the next lecture. But in order for us to even be able to apply our concepts, to judge this is a smiling face, or this is an animal, or this is a house, or whatever, we must first apprehend it as a unity. And this unity, that is what apprehension is about for Kant. This unity is a synthetic one. It is one that we create through our power of imagination. And don't think that the dots that we judge to be eyes and the curved line that we then judge to be a mouth, that they are the basic elements. No, they too are apprehended by us, meaning they too are synthetic unities created by us. I mean, a line is not one thing that we just perceive as one thing. A line is made up of an infinite number of points, and we, again, our power of imagination connects these points to one line. This becomes especially obvious when you think of a very long line that you can't just see all at once. Like if there was a line painted across a long wall, you would walk along the wall and see ever new parts of the line, and it is in your imagination that you connect these parts as belonging to one and the same line. But this is something that doesn't just happen with a longer line. Even a short line, like the smiling mouse of the smiley, even a short line that you can see with one view, even that is connected, even that is apprehended by our power of imagination. The same can be seen in our writing. So, for example, when you have letters, it is you who connects these letters, who apprehends and perceives these letters as unities. Take a lowercase I. There's a dot and there's a line. They are not even connected. So who's to say that they belong to one and the same thing? And again, judging what this thing is, judging that it is the letter I, representing this specific sound, not representing the sound of A or B or whatever, that is a matter for the intellect. That is something I will talk about in the next lecture. But in order for us to even be able to say this letter means that sound, this letter means this sound, we first must apprehend it as this letter, as a unity, and not, for example, as several letters. And that is something our power of imagination does. We who have, I assume, learned writing and reading many, many years ago and are used to it, we don't even really perceive the dot and the line as disconnected. I mean, at least we don't think about it, we don't reflect about it. We perceive it as much as one letter with its parts belonging together, forming a unity, as we perceive another letter whose lines actually touch each other, like the letter A or whatever. And also, on the other hand, you can't say that we perceive one letter as one, as forming a unity, when the lines connect, because the lines of several letters can also connect. When you write with your handwriting, and not like it's printed, you may connect all the letters in one word, but still we still can perceive them, we still can read them as different letters. So obviously perceiving them as one unity is not dependent either on them being connected, because the parts of the lowercase I are not connected, nor on them being not connected, because the various letters in handwriting can be connected and still be apprehended as different letters. And here, of course, the power of imagination also comes into play, insofar as it produces a certain image, it produces the word for us. It's not that we read the word letter by letter. We may do that when we first learn to read, but once we are used to reading, our eye just sort of wanders over the words, and we may only see parts of it, and the power of imagination may sort of fill in the gaps. I mean, it's a well-known phenomenon. There are many studies on that people, when there's a small mistake in a word, like one letter is missing, or maybe two letters are in the wrong order, mostly we just read over that. It doesn't even register that there is a mistake. It would, if we were first learning to read, like a child who is just learning, who is reading every letter, would certainly find this mistake and struggle with it, maybe when trying to read, because the word would not make sense. But we just go over that mistake without registering it, because our power of imagination sort of creates that word for us. I mean, it has been shown that we can even go so far as writing whole sentences in an incorrect way, as long as the first and the last letter of a word is correct, all the other letters in between can be in the wrong, in a chaotic order, and we still can read the word or whole sentence with relative ease. And what I also find interesting is that even when we can't read certain signs, certain letters, if we don't know their meaning, so if you have another alphabet, for example, maybe you can't read the Greek or the Hebrew alphabet, only the Latin one, but still you can apprehend the letters as distinct letters, as unities. You cannot do the last part of what is needed for experience and for empirical cognition. That is the step of intellection, that is understanding what something is. But you can apprehend a letter that you can't read as being one letter, as being distinct from others. Of course, this work of our power of imagination is not just helpful, it can also cause problems. This sort of filling in the gap and imagining things instead of actually seeing them as they are. It is a problem, for example, when it comes to reading. And when it comes to reading, I realized very early on in my youth that most people are illiterate. By which I don't mean that they can't read letters, that they can't read out a word aloud correctly, but I mean they have no actual literacy. They have no understanding of a text they read or of something they hear. And this is a phenomenon that is so widespread that if you have not noticed it in your life, then I have bad news for you. That can only mean that you too are illiterate and therefore don't realize how bad other people's literacy is, because yours is equally bad. I mean, only if you understand the text correctly can you realize when others don't understand it. But if you have actual literacy, then it becomes very obvious what Nietzsche remarked, that when reading a text of, say, 100 words, people are only reading maybe 20 words, and they are sort of just inventing the other 80 words with their power of imagination, thereby creating a more or less completely different text from the one that's actually there. I've found that a lot when it comes to philosophical texts. For example, when I studied in many of my classes, there were the most crazy, the grossest misunderstandings of these texts. Misunderstandings that were so stupid that you can't explain it by stupidity. This, by the way, is a general tip I give you. Whenever you find people doing something grossly stupid, like too stupid to be possible, so stupid that you ask yourself, how can anyone be that stupid? It is better to assume that no one is that stupid. It is better to assume that the problem here is not actual stupidity, an actual lack of intellectual capacities, but rather the issue is probably something else, some sort of unaufklärdness. And this can have many reasons, like, for example, when people don't know a word. So, for example, I often talk about Aufklärung, but I also often talk about Ausklärung. Um, Aufklärung being actually thinking for yourself, thinking critically, being rational. Um, that which is usually called enlightenment in English. So I'm not happy with that translation, and I have a lecture on why I'm not. Weil Ausklärung, there is no English translation for it, not even a bad translation, but if you translate Aufklärung with enlightenment, then you could translate Ausklärung with entwilightment. It basically is the half of Aufklärung that thinks itself to be the whole. It is the arrogant pseudo-Aufklärung that believes to already be aufklärt because it freed itself from some superstitions, from some prejudices, and now thinks it's not necessary to also become actually rational, rather which thinks that reason, rationality, that too is just a superstitious prejudice. Now, the thing is that this word Ausklärung is not just not translated into English, but even in German, it's extremely uncommon. No one knows this word. Even if you ask professors of philosophology, they would usually not be able to tell you what that word means. They would probably tell you that they have never heard it in most cases. It is not a word that is commonly used. I mean, of course, we live in extremely ausgeklärt times, and what is most common and most widespread is usually what people reflect about the least, exactly because it is so common that they don't even notice it. They are just so used to it. I didn't come up with the word. Like, it's not my invention. In that case, it, of course, that would explain why other people wouldn't know it. You can find it here and there in Fichte or in Hegel, but there are only a few mentions in their works. Like Fichte, I think uses it only one time, maybe twice. They don't have a more thorough theory of Ausklärung as I have. So it is very easy to miss when reading them. My point is that I have often found here in these very Kant lectures, but also in my texts on my website, that when I talk or when I write about Ausklärung, many people just hear or just read Aufklärung. And then when they later talk about it, I have, for example, found someone trying to repeat or trying to summarize my words to other people in a place where I had criticized Ausklärung, but he turned it into a criticism of Aufklärung, which of course was not my intent, because I tried to spread Aufklärung. I am not criticizing Aufklärung, I am criticizing the misunderstanding that confuses Aufklärung with Ausklärung. And I try to point out that the usual criticisms directed against Aufklärung, against the so-called Age of Enlightenment, are really only directed at its ausklärt side, at the side that is not fully aufklärt yet. But the thing is, since these words sound so similar, and since people don't know the word Ausklärung and have never heard it, they just skip over it. Either they don't hear it at all, they just hear Aufklärung, even though I didn't say it, or they may hear that I said Ausklärung, but they don't really think anything of it. They probably think that I misspoke and mispronounced the word or whatever, that it wasn't intentional. And that is what I mean when I say people are illiterate not because they are stupid, but rather the issue is they don't read word for word, and they don't understand each single word the way it should be understood in that sentence, but rather they read a few words and they just imagine the meaning that the sentence might have. And if they come across a word that they don't know, it often doesn't register with it. They often just transform and translate it into a somewhat similar sounding word that they do know. And this, as I said, is extremely common. It doesn't just happen with philosophical text, where maybe you could excuse people saying, oh, these texts are hard, they're hard to understand. No, even the most simple text, like a newspaper article or a comment in some comment section online, even those are constantly misunderstood. I just have to think on my experience of tutoring students. But don't explain that away by saying, oh, those were just students, those were just kids, they haven't learned reading properly yet. I could also give many examples of grown-up people, people in their 40s or 50s or whatever, who couldn't read any better. But for example, I remember one student had to write an opinion piece on should there be plebiscites in Germany. So should there be votes not just on the parties and who forms the governments, but also direct votes on certain decisions. And he had to write his opinion, but he had to base it on a newspaper article and agree or disagree with the article. And in that article, some experts said that statistically we could see that women tend to vote less frequently in these. And therefore, maybe it would not be good to have these, because that would then end up discriminating women, because men would vote more often, and therefore man's opinions, man's wishes would be more represented in politics. And what the student vote is, I agree that it would be a good thing to have such votes, because that would advance women's rights. Or I remember one student had to write an interpretation of a poem by Bertolt Brecht, and it was the poem An die Nachgeborenen, so to the ones born after us, which Brecht wrote in exile during the Nazi times. And in that poem, he asks the question, what kind of time is it where it is almost a crime to have a conversation about trees, because it includes being silent about so many other things. By the way, a poem which I think is very much relevant today, except that today you almost have to turn it around in the face of the climate and ecological crisis, in the face of the rainforest being cut down, and ask what kind of time is it where a conversation about anything else but trees is almost a crime, because it includes being silent about so much else. But the point is, the student ended up asking, why is he talking to trees? And mind you, these students, both of them were close to graduating. Both of them were like 17, 18, meaning they are basically legal adults. They are basically allowed to vote, even though obviously they don't understand the basics of politics. They are not able to understand a simple newspaper article. And this second student, he wasn't some refugee who had come to Germany recently and only learned German for 3 months or so. He had grown up here, and still he apparently didn't know the difference between the word to and the word about. Like, talking about trees and talking to trees is not the same. And it's not the same in German either. It's two different words in German too. And that's exactly an example of what I said previously. I mean, no one can be this stupid. Let's be real. Every little child knows the difference between talking about something and talking to something or someone. And this student too knows the difference between the words about and to. And that's exactly the reason why you shouldn't explain it by sheer stupidity. Rather, the point is that we don't read word for word. We don't read what is actually written. We only read a few words. Like in this case, he probably read conversation and tree. And then we just imagine the rest of the text. We imagine what it might say. And he imagined something about having conversations with trees. This, by the way, just to avoid misunderstandings, this is not the apprehension that Kant talks about. When he talks about apprehension in the critique of pure reason, apprehension is not our power of imagination, imagining things that are not there and filling in the gaps, so to say, with its own image. Apprehension is just about collecting and connecting our various sensations to form one perception, to turn into one image. I just wanted to use this opportunity to talk about this, I think, important topic. And I do think it is helpful to, in general, become more aware of the role the power of imagination plays in our perception. But anyway, all of this is not just true when it comes to signs, to symbols, to letters, to reading or to perceiving a smiley, but also to our perception in general. Like, you probably know how your power of imagination can turn clouds or shadows or the lines on some wood into figures, into images, into maybe animals or whatever. And here it should be very obvious that we put them together, we apprehend them in a certain way. Like, if I say, oh, these lines here in the wood, they look like some animal, it's not that these lines really are connected in some thing in itself outside of me. It's that I connect them in my imagination. I apprehend them as belonging to one image, while I probably apprehend other lines in the same wood right next to them as not belonging to that image. And here in this example, everyone would agree that we create this unity. But even in other cases where you think that the unity actually is out there in the world and you just passively take it in, no, you actually create it. All unities, all connections are synthesized directly, or in this case indirectly, by the intellect. So this is maybe most obvious when it comes to things that are made up of several disconnected parts. Like, for example, when you say, I see a wood, I see a forest, what you really see is several trees. And it is you who apprehends all of these trees as belonging together. I don't want to say as belonging to one forest, because applying the concept of forest to them, judging that this is a forest and not a meadow or whatever, that again is something the intellect does. That is what I want to talk about in the next lecture. But just apprehending the trees as belonging to one unity, that is something you do through the power of imagination. Likewise, when you say, I see a city, you see several houses, and it is you who apprehends all of them in the perception of one city, one settlement. So again, judging that it is a city is not part of apprehension. And you can't say that this is just because they belong together, or because the houses of this city, they are disconnected from other cities. I mean, there are examples of cities that have basically grown together, so there is no empty field between them. You don't really see where one ends and one begins. It is us who may apprehend these buildings as belonging to one city and these buildings as not belonging to it. But even when it comes to things that seem to be just one connected object, not an aggregate of several objects, even then it is the power of imagination apprehending various sensations in one perception, which makes it one object. Here I get to a point where it becomes difficult to find good examples, because I mean, that's basically in the nature of this thing I'm talking about. I'm talking about something which constitutes our experience, our perception, which first makes it possible. So of course I can't really give an example from perception, because this is something that happens before perception, so to say. But maybe I can at least give you a sense of what I'm talking about by my examples. They may not be the actual thing, but they may point in the direction of the actual thing. So I will say that not just a whole forest is only apprehended as one forest, but even a single tree. Kant would say you don't really see the tree. Your impressions are a collection of green and brown and rustling of leaves and the smell of the tree. And once again, it is through the power of imagination that you apprehend all of these various impressions, the content of your perception, happening in space and time, the form of your perception, as being connected. And only that turns them into actually one perception instead of many different perceptions. Maybe this is most obvious when it comes to little newborn babies, because they are not yet doing that so much. So their world is probably more of a chaos of manifold impressions, and they don't necessarily synthesize them into distinct unities yet, which also means that they are not yet separating other things as clearly from themselves. So for the baby there probably isn't such a clear distinction. Here am I, and here is my mother's breast on which I'm sucking. Something which psychology, which psychoanalysis had a lot to say about. But maybe you yourself um, even though you are not a baby anymore, at least I assume that there are not too many babies listening to me, maybe you can also reflect on this and realize how much of how you seem to perceive the world comes from your imagination. Often it's especially when we are not so aware of something, when maybe it happens in the corner of our eye only, or we are not paying attention to it. Um, like maybe I'm sitting at a bus stop waiting for the bus while reading my book, and there's something in the corner of my eye flying by, and I think it's a bird, but really it's just a leaf falling down from a tree. Or maybe some woman is sitting down next to me and there's something white between her legs, and I think she has a little dog. But when I actually turn my head and look, it's just her handbag that she put between her legs. Also, just because I'm giving lots and lots of visual examples, you shouldn't think that this is restricted to seeing. Rather, this is true for all our sensations. So, for example, when hearing, it is the same. And here too, you can note that a lot of things we don't really quite hear distinctly, but rather our power of imagination makes them up and fills in once again the gaps for us. So maybe you have noted sometimes that when you mishear, when you didn't catch what someone is saying, and you ask that person to repeat it, sometimes you suddenly know what the person said even before he repeated his words. Now, how can you have suddenly understood him when you didn't the first time, and when there hasn't been a second time yet, when he hasn't had the time to repeat himself yet? Clearly, you have no new sensations, no new data, so to say, no new content for your perception. So what changed can only be the way that this data was put together and that the gaps were filled in. Clearly, suddenly your power of imagination managed to put it together into an image which made more sense for you. We can realize how little we actually hear, distinctly hear, and how much we are imagining when we are listening to a foreign language. Like, very often it's just gibberish if the language is unfamiliar. Maybe we even have a hard time distinguishing the words. Like, not understanding the words. Of course, we can't do that if we don't have the vocabulary, but just distinguishing when one word ends and a new word starts. And I mean, if it was just about listening and hearing, we should be able to perfectly hear and perfectly repeat a language even without understanding a single word. Because that would just be about the sensation we have, while understanding is about intellection. It is about which concepts we connect with the words. Again, I will talk about this in the next lecture. But that is clearly not the case. Like, you could take 5 people who don't know a certain language, like for example English, and you could make them listen to a speech and tell them to write the speech down, just the way they heard it, just the way it sounded, and you would probably end up with 5 completely different texts. And if you didn't know better, you probably couldn't even tell that they are all based on the same speech. And even when a language is spoken that you do understand, but there's maybe one word that you don't understand, like maybe a name. For example, let's say you meet someone from a foreign place, like who has some African or Indian name that you have never heard, And he's introducing himself in perfect English, but still that one word, that one name is so unfamiliar, you will probably need him to repeat himself. Maybe you aren't sure about certain sounds. You are not sure, maybe, did I hear a B or did I hear a V? But that should show us that even in a language we do speak, and even with words and names we do know, we probably don't actually hear every single sound distinctly. But rather, since we know the general word or the name in general, it is enough to hear something which sounds somewhat like it, and our power of imagination will fill in the gap, and we will think that we heard this word when in fact we didn't really, and if we didn't know that word, we probably wouldn't be able to repeat what we just heard. I remember a while ago I was in the subway and I was reading my book, and someone approached me from the side and started talking to me, and because I didn't expect that and I was so submerged into my book, I at first didn't understand him correctly, also because he was a foreigner and his German was kind of broken. And actually what he wanted to ask me is if this train goes to Cottbuser Tor, which is a train station. But what I thought he was saying was, if the book I was reading was a good book. I thought he was saying, gut Buch ist, which would translate to good book is, and which would be just as incorrect grammatically as in English. But again, he was speaking broken German, so I thought he was asking me in bad German if it was a good book. So clearly, my power of imagination turned the Kott of Cottbuser Tor into gut, which means good, and the Bo of Cottbuser Tor into Buch, which means book, and the S of Cottbuser Tor into ist, which means is. And the R and the Tor, it completely left out. And this is something, once again, that happens quite frequently. But going back to Kant, I once again want to stress that apprehension is not this filling in of the gaps and this misimagining things that are not there. The mere act of apprehension is just collecting the power of imagination, collecting the various sensations into one perception, synthesizing them so they can be one image. And that is what is the fundament for our cognition, for our experience. In a previous lecture, I used the example of an archaeologist digging out some object he doesn't know yet. He doesn't know if what he's apprehending, what he's perceiving here, if it is an ancient tool or a cult object or whatever, meaning he has no intellection yet. He has not yet in his intellect formed the concept which can be applied to this object. But he already perceives it, so he apprehends his various sensation that the object gives him as being one, as belonging to one perception. He already perceives it as one object. And for example, as when he holds it in his hand, not belonging to that hand, perceiving his hand as a different object. And this apprehension clearly is necessary. It must come first before I can judge what kind of object that may be. If there wasn't even this apprehension first, which again is directed by the intellect, but the synthesis itself is done through our power of imagination. If that didn't happen first, then we would just have this chaos, this tohu vabohu, to say it in biblical language, of various sensations. And on a side note, the Bible tells about how at first there was tohu vabohu, so chaos, emptiness and desertness, and waste. And then God sort of brought order into it and created the world from it. And later the Bible says that man is created, Adam. And I mean, Adam is not the first name of a guy whose name is Adam and not Kevin or whatever, but rather Adam actually means man, the human being. So God creates humankind, and then it is said he creates the human in his image. And later he tasks the human with giving names to the things of the world, like to the various animals. So we could interpret it. We could interpret this as the names given being not just names, like meaningless words, meaningless sounds, but rather being concepts. So naming the things means understanding them, understanding what they actually are. And we could say that in this lies man being the image of God. Kant says all our sensation gives us is material, is a lawless manifold, a chaos of sensations, of impressions, but it is through our thinking, which really is just connecting, synthesizing. It is through our thinking that there's form given to it, that there's a sort of order given to it. And this, I would say, could be interpreted as a sort of divine act, as a sort of being an image of the act of God. But back to Kant. In the last lecture, in the lecture on sensuality, I said that the power of imagination can be productive or reproductive. While Kant does say that apprehension is an act of the productive power of imagination, reproduction also plays a role in our perceptions. Otherwise, we would just have a picture of the moment that would immediately vanish again to be replaced by another disconnected picture. But rather what we are doing, of course, again, through the power of our imagination, is connecting different images. Kant gives the example of ice and water. So if one moment I see ice, and then I see water there in the same place later on, I actually connect these two with the power of imagination. I understand them to be one and the same thing. To already briefly get into what I will talk about in future lectures, Kant has these 12 categories, these 12 concepts of our pure intellect, and according to them, all the connecting happens. So one of them is substance. I understand the ice and the water to be the same substance, even if the accidents, that is, the attributes of that substance, even if they changed, I understand that the substance itself is still the same. And likewise, I connect these two images of ice and water according to the concept of causality, which is another of the 12 categories. So I understand that there is a cause, that the ice is the cause of the water. The ice melted and became the water. So when I'm now perceiving the water, I'm reproducing the image of the ice, and I apprehend them as belonging together. Another example that Kant gives, I already mentioned in previous lectures, this example of the savage who sees a house, and Kant says that he doesn't know what he's seeing because he doesn't know what a house is. And as the famous statement of Kant goes, viewing or intuition without concepts is blind. If the intellect is not providing a concept, I don't know what I'm viewing there. And again, the intellect providing concepts, I will get into in the next lecture. But even though the savage, even though he doesn't understand what it is that he's apprehending, can still apprehend the house. And I'm not seeing the house all at once, probably. Like, now I will look at the base, and then I turn my gaze upwards, and I look at the roof of the house, or I walk around, and now I see the house from another side. So clearly I'm not seeing the side anymore that I saw first. But still, I can have this image of what I saw first and the image of what I'm seeing now, and I apprehend them, the current image with the reproduced previous image, I apprehend them as belonging together to one thing, even though I don't yet know what that thing is, even though I don't yet have the concept of a house. That would only be the third part of our cognition, of our experience. Well, to conclude this, what Kant is saying is that thinking means forming connections, means doing a synthesis, and thereby creating a synthetic unity of the manifold. And now we have seen in this lecture and the previous one that this happens on both sides of our cognition. So in the last lecture I talked about apperception, meaning that thinking brings synthetic unity into itself, so to say. Meaning that we say the various representations, the various images, the thoughts, the feelings, the perceptions, they are representations in the same consciousness, in my consciousness. They belong to me, to the same I, to the same subject. So the apperception is the act of bringing synthetic unity into the subject. Well, then the apprehension, which the apperception is done through the intellect, or as Kant would also say, it is itself the intellect that constitutes the intellect. The apprehension, on the other hand, is done by the power of imagination, but, so to say, directed or on the impulse of the intellect. And apprehension brings synthetic unity into the manifold of the object, making what would otherwise be this chaos of colors and smells and tastes and sounds into one perception, which then, again, that would be the third stage, which I will address next, which then can be understood, can be judged as being this or being that thing. What I want to conclude with here, and what is extremely important to Kant's whole philosophy, is that these two acts, apperception and apprehension, they rely on each other. So I can only apprehend various sensations as belonging together because they are in that is in the same consciousness. So for example, let's say I see a rose. When I say the green color of the leaves that I see, and the red color of the blossom, and the smell that I smell, when I apprehend all of those as belonging to one object, when my power of imagination apprehends them, so takes them into itself, into the power of imagination, to form one perception of this one object. I could say of the rose, but I try to avoid saying that because judging that this object I'm perceiving is a rose, that would already mean the intellect coming up with a concept for it and understanding it. And that is not what I'm addressing here in this lecture. But just apprehending the green and the red and the smell as belonging to one object. No matter if I judge that object to be a rose or a tulip or a car or whatever. That is only possible because I find that all of these sensations are my sensations. I, who sees the green, and I, who sees the red, and I, who smells the smell of the rose, it's always the same I. So this unity, this synthetic unity of apperception, makes the empirical unity of apprehension possible. If these various sensations were sensed by different people, like I am sensing green and someone else, somewhere else is sensing red, I could not really put them together. I could not apprehend them together as one perception. But then on the other hand, I can only apperceive my various representations. So again, the green, the red, the smell, as all belonging to me, belonging to the same I, to the same subject, because I apprehend them as belonging together in one perception of one object. Like, since I'm saying that the green, the red, the smell, the rose smell, that they are connected in one object, that is why the I who senses the green, and the I who senses the red, and the I who senses the rose smell must be the same I, because these are also the same. They are connected in the same object. So therefore, the synthetic unity of apprehension is needed in order for me to be able to synthesize myself, to create the synthetic unity of apperception. So these two come together, and that means that they must function along the same rules. And that leads to the categories of the intellect, because Kant says that there are 12 ways in which our thinking can form connections, which leads to 12 categories, 12 pure concepts. Like I mentioned, the one of substance and causality in this lecture, being two of them. Well, if all our thinking, all our connecting is done along these 12 concepts, And if we don't just synthesize ourselves as the subject in our thinking, but also through the power of imagination, which is directed by the thinking, we synthesize the sensations we have to form the objects which we perceive. That means that all our experience, and not just the actual experience, but even the mere perceptions, which are not experienced yet, but only get put together to form experiences, but even the perceptions must be under these 12 categories. So, even though I said in the previous lecture on sensuality that perceptions are sensual and therefore passive, I perceive certain sensations in time and space. Actually, it is more correct to say that even the sensual, the empirical representation that is perception, even here there is an active, spontaneous side, a side that comes from the intellect, and that is, once again, the power of imagination putting the various sensations together into one perception, forming a synthetic unity of them. And without the power of imagination doing that, we would not even have perceptions. We would just have this complete chaos of sensations. And since the power of imagination can only do that under the direction of the intellect, and since the intellect can only form connections in these 12 ways, that means that these 12 ways of connecting and that these 12 categories are the conditions of the possibility of all our experience, or even of all our perceptions. And all our perceptions must therefore conform to these 12 categories we have, or else we could not perceive them. Now, what exactly these categories are, what Kant says about them, that I will say in a previous lecture, because in the next lecture I will start turning to the intellect's concepts and to how the intellect through our concepts understands things that we otherwise would just perceive without knowing what they are. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pei, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.